There are many ways for a king to fall. A bullet, a betrayal, a miscalculation. But how does a man like Lucky Luciano, the architect of America's most sophisticated criminal empire, come closer to losing everything not from a rival's gun, but from a secret buried deep within his own creation? This is the haunting question that shadows every chapter of his life. A question whispered through the alleys he once ruled. A question even his enemies never fully understood. Because Luciano's greatest threat did not come from the streets. It came from within the walls of his own empire. The empire he built, and the shadow beneath it. For years, Lucky Luciano seemed untouchable. He had turned chaos into order, transformed scattered gangs into a national syndicate, and created a structure so efficient that it operated like a silent machine humming beneath America's booming cities. He was the man who ended wars, unified rivals, and rewrote the rules of power. A mastermind who wielded influence without raising his voice. A strategist who understood people not by what they said but by what they feared. Yet even the cleanest architecture hides cracks. Even the most loyal circle can conceal a traitor. Beneath Luciano's empire, beneath the meetings, the profits, the calm exterior, something dangerous was growing. A secret that would almost destroy him. A betrayal so subtle he could not see it until it was too late. And it wasn't the betrayal itself that nearly ruined him. It was the realization that he, the great architect of control, had misread the one thing he believed he understood better than anyone: loyalty. A man who trusted systems, not people. Luciano's genius lay not in violence but in structure. He built systems that made men predictable. Systems that reduced the risk of betrayal. Systems where personal emotion played no role, only profit, logic, and stability. To him, trust was never about affection. It was about calculation. You trusted a man because his interests aligned with yours, his survival depended on your survival, his ambition did not threaten your stability. Luciano believed he had engineered a model immune to the chaos of the past. A model that protected him from surprises. But even the greatest system cannot anticipate the one variable that refuses to be controlled: human nature. The betrayal that would nearly break him was not loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't announce itself with a gunshot. It whispered. It hid behind obedience. Behind familiar faces. Behind the illusion of stability. The moment everything nearly collapsed, Luciano was not a man easily shaken. He survived assassination attempts, gang wars, political crusades, and the unpredictable fury of men like Maranzano and Masuria. But when the betrayal inside his own circle surfaced, something shifted, not just in his empire but in his mind. For the first time, Luciano felt the fear not of dying, but of losing control. The empire he built was designed to outlast bullets. But it was not designed to withstand treachery woven into its foundation. This near collapse was not a footnote in his life. It was the moment that forced him to confront the one weakness he could not engineer out of existence: trust. The story of Lucky Luciano is not simply the story of power. It is the story of how a man who mastered influence nearly lost everything because of a secret hidden in the shadows of his own success. A psychological journey into loyalty and doubt. This is not a tale of gangsters, guns, and glamorous crime. It is an internal story, a psychological journey into the mind of a man who built power through understanding others, only to realize he had misunderstood the people closest to him. It is the story of loyalty tested in silence, trust stretched to its breaking point, ambition poisoning the bonds he thought were unbreakable, and the terrifying moment when the architect must question his own blueprint. Because the deeper you go into Luciano's life, the more you learn that power is not won on the streets. It is won in the spaces between people, in the shadows of their intentions. And it is lost there too. The secret that changed everything. This book follows Luciano from the slums of the Lower East Side to the heights of the commission he created, and finally to the heartbreak of exile. But beneath every triumph and every downfall lingers the same haunting thread, a secret buried in his rise. A betrayal wrapped in loyalty. A moment that reshaped the empire he built, and the man he became. The question is not whether Luciano built the Mafia. He did. The question is, what nearly destroyed him? And why couldn't he see it coming? In the shadows, the answer waits. And once revealed, it changes the meaning of everything that came before. Before Lucky Luciano ever became the architect of a new criminal order, the underworld he stepped into was a battlefield stitched together by grudges, blood, and old-world loyalties that didn't survive American soil. It was violent. It was divided. It was unpredictable. And it was the perfect place for a man like Luciano to rise. A man who saw unity where others saw tribes, opportunity where others saw danger, and systems where others saw chaos. But within that fractured world lay the seed of something darker, the kind of secrecy that protects a kingdom, and the kind that can quietly destroy it. A patchwork of tribes. The Mafia before Luciano. New York's early Mafia was not the monolithic force it later became. It was a quilt of clans, each stitched together by geography, dialect, and grudges imported from Sicilian hillsides and Neapolitan alleys. The Italian underworld was split into factions. Sicilians who despised Neapolitans, Calabrians who trusted no one, old world mafiosi who refused to adapt, new arrivals who fought for scraps, independent street gangs who bowed to none. Each group treated their neighborhood like a sovereign nation. Each boss believed himself a king. Each feud risked plunging the streets into chaos. Violence was not the result of calculated strategy, it was the default language. The Mafia before Luciano wasn't an organization. It was a storm. Old world codes in a new world city. The leaders of these factions clung to Sicilian traditions without understanding the world they now lived in. Honor mattered more than profit. Revenge mattered more than peace. A slight could ignite a war. A rumor could end a life. Their survival strategies were relics. Blood oaths, rigid hierarchies, blind obedience, a refusal to cooperate with outsiders. But New York was not Sicily. Here, power moved faster than tradition could follow. Yet the old bosses held tightly to rituals they barely understood anymore, creating a culture where secrecy became absolute, not strategic but suffocating. Men were expected to obey without context. Plans were made without explanation. Orders were carried out without reasoning. It was a world built on trust without understanding. And behind that kind of trust often hides betrayal. The streets as a war zone. The Lower East Side, Little Italy, Harlem, and Brooklyn all bore the scars of the Mafia's fragmentation. Gangs fought over bootlegging routes, gambling dens, and protection rackets. Turf wars so frequent that newspapers simply grouped them under the headline Italian Troubles. Every week brought a new body, a bookie shot behind a bakery, a captain stabbed outside a church, a driver found floating in a river, a bomb exploding under a restaurant window. The violence was constant, but worse, it was chaotic. No one was thinking long-term. No one calculated risk. No one understood the cost of unpredictability. This was the world Luciano stepped into, a world ruled by fear, ego, and bloodlines. To survive, he'd need something stronger than muscle. To rise, he'd need something more powerful than tradition. Luciano's ascendance, seeing order within chaos from the start, Luciano saw what others couldn't. The chaos was not an obstacle, it was an opportunity. Where bosses saw enemies, he saw alliances. Where they saw borders, he saw networks. Where they saw dishonor, he saw inefficiency. Luciano understood that violence was a tool, not a strategy. He understood that profit required stability. He understood that leadership required cooperation, not tyranny. He became the rare figure who could speak to Sicilians without being constrained by Sicilian pride, work with Jewish gangs without caring about tradition, partner with Irish crews without fearing betrayal, negotiate with street hustlers and old dons in the same breath. This ability made him invaluable and dangerous. The underworld, as divided as it was, recognized something in Luciano that it had never seen before. A man who could unite factions without forcing them to surrender themselves. But unity had a price. And unity required secrecy. Not the blind secrecy of the old Mafia, but a new kind of secrecy, sharper and more intelligent. One that could strengthen an empire. One that, years later, would nearly destroy its creator. Unity as a weapon, and a weakness. As Luciano forged alliances, he discovered the most important truth of his rise. The thing that unites men can also break them. He used secrecy as a weapon, to protect plans, to shield alliances, to conceal negotiations, to outmaneuver rivals. But secrecy is a double-edged sword. It protects loyalties, but it also hides betrayal. The very structure Luciano was building relied on whispered conversations, private deals, unspoken understandings, coded loyalties, silence between leaders. Every man who joined his circle grew more powerful, but also more difficult to read. And in a world where every faction had its own agenda, the line between ally and traitor was razor thin. Luciano believed he could control this balance. He believed he understood every man at his table. He believed unity and secrecy together made him invincible. But below the surface, in the cracks of the alliances he forged, something dangerous was taking shape, the kind of threat that only grows in shadows. Why the underworld needed a man like him. Luciano didn't rise because he was more violent. He rose because he was more necessary. He was the only man who saw wars as wasteful, grudges as liabilities, tradition as outdated, cooperation as the future. He offered the underworld what no one else could, a blueprint for survival. And in return, the underworld offered him loyalty, or what passed for loyalty in a world built on fear and secrecy. But every kingdom built on quiet alliances carries a hidden weakness. All it takes is one betrayal from one trusted man, in one unguarded moment, for everything to fall apart. The violent, divided world Luciano entered shaped him. The unity he brought to it elevated him. And the secrecy required to hold it together would become the shadow that followed him to the end. The empire was rising. But beneath it, the secret was already forming, silent, patient, inevitable. Before he was Lucky Luciano, he was Salvatore Lucania, a boy born into a world that offered little and demanded much. His earliest memories were not of opportunity but of limitation. Narrow Sicilian roads, stone houses pressed together like clenched fists, and an economy so suffocating that ambition felt like an act of rebellion. Hunger came early, not just for food but for more. More possibilities, more freedom, more control over his fate. That hunger would follow him across an ocean. Sicily, the first lessons in power and fear. Sicily was a land shaped by tradition, silence, and survival. Salvatore learned quickly that power belonged not to the loudest man, but to the one everyone feared, or relied upon. Local mafiosi commanded respect simply by existing, their presence a constant reminder that violence lived just beneath the surface of daily life. The boy watched them with unblinking eyes. Their hushed conversations, their calculated movements, their effortless dominance. He didn't admire the violence, he admired the certainty that came with it. But Sicily offered no path for a poor boy to climb. Life was predetermined, opportunities dried before they ripened. His father realized what Salvatore already sensed. Their future wasn't here. The decision to leave for America wasn't heroic. It was desperate. And desperation is often the first spark of ambition. Arrival in America. A new world, same hardships. New York's Lower East Side did not welcome the Lucania family with open arms. It greeted them with overcrowded tenements, polluted air, and an immigrant hierarchy that placed Italians near the bottom. The American dream was louder here but just as elusive. Salvatore, now Charlie, to fit the new world, learned English in school and survival in the streets. He found that America had its own codes. Strength earned respect, weakness drew predators, alliances meant protection, isolation meant danger. He adapted quickly. He watched harder. He understood faster than boys his age. The Lower East Side became his battlefield and his classroom. Violence as a language, and a warning. Street fights were common, often unavoidable. Older boys targeted immigrants. Irish kids pushed Italians around. Gangs prowled the alleys testing newcomers. Charlie didn't enjoy fighting. But he understood its purpose. Each confrontation built his psychological armor. A punch taught him resilience, a threat taught him precision, a betrayal taught him caution. He survived because he thought before he struck, learned before he leapt. Violence didn't shape him into a monster, it carved him into a strategist. But even then he noticed something unsettling. Those closest to him could turn just as quickly as enemies. It was his first glimpse of the fragile loyalties that would later define, and haunt, his rise. The first friendships, a glimpse of power beyond bloodlines in a neighborhood divided by ethnicity. Charlie did something unexpected. He crossed boundaries. He befriended Jewish kids, Irish kids, anyone whose mind or courage impressed him. That tendency would become his trademark. His meeting with Meyer Lansky became the single most defining moment of his youth. The story goes that Charlie tried to extort a group of Jewish boys. Lansky refused, not with aggression, but with a calm defiance that struck Charlie deeply. He recognized intelligence, steadiness, and something even rarer, restraint. Instead of turning into enemies, Lansky and Charlie became allies. They were opposites. Charlie was instinct and charisma. Lansky was logic and calculation. Together they learned how numbers, negotiation, and organization could be more powerful than fists. But where Lansky offered loyalty, others did not. Early betrayals in their shared circles taught Charlie something critical. Trust was always conditional, even friendship carried risks. Another future ally, Bugsy Siegel, emerged as the opposite of Lansky, volatile, fearless, unpredictable. Siegel's violence was a weapon, Lansky's mind was a compass. Charlie positioned himself between these forces, balancing chaos and calculation. It was an early blueprint of the kind of empire he would one day build. Small-time hustles, discovering his talent for command as Charlie drifted into petty hustles, running errands, handling bets, delivering messages, something became clear. He was better at organizing crime than committing it. He saw how money flowed, how secrets moved, how fear motivated, how loyalty fractured. And he could predict outcomes with uncanny accuracy. His reputation grew not because he was the toughest kid on the block, but because he was the one who could solve problems. He diffused conflicts, brokered deals, and turned chaos into opportunity. Even older gang members began to recognize his value. But with recognition came envy. And with envy came danger. Charlie began noticing whispers behind him, boys who wanted his job, his connections, his influence. The line between loyalty and rivalry blurred. It was his first taste of the political battlefield that would define his adult life. Ambition ignites, a mind too big for the streets. By his late teens, Charlie had outgrown the Lower East Side mentally, even if he was still rooted there physically. Petty rackets felt beneath him. Street fights felt primitive. Small profits felt like distractions. He wanted scale. He wanted structure. He wanted something that couldn't be toppled by fists or tempers. He didn't yet know he would one day build the Mafia's most powerful era. But he sensed it, the way an architect senses the shape of a building long before drawing its lines. And in that early rise, in that early hunger, the first cracks appeared. Friends who weren't fully friends, loyalties based on convenience, alliances built on unspoken tensions. The betrayals would come later. But the shadows were already forming. The birth of Lucky Luciano. Charlie Lucania learned that survival was not about strength. It was about understanding the forces that moved people. He learned that ambition was not greed. It was the refusal to accept the world as it was. He learned that loyalty was not guaranteed. It had to be managed, watched, and sometimes feared. And with every lesson, every scar, every whispered threat, the boy known as Charlie slowly became the man the world would one day call Lucky Luciano. Not because he was lucky, but because he was prepared, even when everyone else in his world was blind. The rise of Lucky Luciano was not the rise of a single man, it was the rise of a network, a structure, an idea. In a world consumed by tribal grudges and chaotic violence, Luciano offered something radical: order. He didn't seek to rule through fear. He sought to rule through architecture, through systems so effective that chaos would become obsolete. Yet as he climbed higher, restructuring the very bones of the underworld, the shadows behind him lengthened. For every alliance he built, a jealousy sharpened. For every innovation he introduced, an old world boss felt threatened. And for every victory he claimed, a silent enemy watched and waited. The empire was rising. But so were the forces that would one day help tear it down. The alliance that changed everything: Lansky and Siegel. If Luciano was the architect, Meyer Lansky was the engineer who brought blueprints to life. Their partnership was built not on ethnicity or obligation, but on recognition. Each saw in the other what few possessed: the capacity to think beyond survival. Lansky's strength was precision. Luciano's was vision. Together, they created the foundation of a criminal economy larger than anything America had ever seen. Bugsy Siegel completed the triad: volatile, fearless, and effective. Siegel was the man who walked into dangerous rooms so Luciano didn't have to. He handled threats, forced negotiations, and ensured compliance where diplomacy failed. Luciano didn't build an empire alone. He built it by assembling the right minds, the right muscle, and the right loyalties. But even then, loyalties were not perfect. Even then, cracks were forming, small resentments from men who felt overshadowed, overlooked, or unnecessary. Restructuring the underworld, innovation in the dark. Luciano understood something no old world boss had grasped. Crime in America could no longer be local. It had to be organized, distributed, scalable. He began restructuring operations at every level. 1. Bootlegging becomes a supply chain rather than allowing crews to run independent operations. Luciano designed a network of coordinators, transporters, warehouse managers, enforcers. Everything moved through predictable routes, time schedules, and coded communication. It was efficient, profitable, and shockingly modern. 2. Gambling gets standardized. He convinced independent bookmakers to align their odds and payout structures. Disputes were mediated through designated negotiators rather than violence. This reduced risk and increased credibility. Gamblers trusted houses that remained stable. 3. Prostitution becomes regulated and quiet. Gone were the days of violent pimps. Luciano built a system of madams who maintained disciplined medical examinations to maintain product value, rotations to avoid police attention, fixed pricing models. It was cold, calculated, and disturbingly effective. 4. Labor unions become leverage. Luciano understood that controlling unions meant controlling industries. His influence over longshoremen, truckers, and construction workers allowed the Mafia to dictate which companies thrived and which collapsed. For businessmen and politicians, Luciano's empire became both a threat and a necessity. His innovations gave him power. His innovations also gave him visibility, a dangerous currency. Eliminating the old world bosses, a quiet revolution to build a modern empire, Luciano needed to remove the reigning tyrants. Men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, whose rule depended on tradition and terror. These men saw Luciano as talented, but too ambitious, too Americanized, too unpredictable. He repaid their doubt with strategy. Masuria fell first, betrayed by men Luciano had quietly aligned with Maranzano. Maranzano followed soon after, killed by hitmen Maranzano never considered a threat, Jewish assassins, a break from Sicilian tradition that symbolized the dawn of a new era. With their deaths, the last barriers to Luciano's vision were gone. He created the Commission, a governing council built to maintain balance and prevent future wars, a parliament of crime, the first of its kind. The Mafia was finally organized. Peace settled over the underworld. Profit soared. But peace, Luciano knew, is a fragile thing. And beneath it, old grudges calcified into new resentments. Alliances built on opportunity and danger. Every man who joined Luciano's system benefited from it. Every man also grew wary of it. Some feared that his power was too centralized. Some feared that he favored Lansky and Siegel more than Italian-born mafiosi. Some feared that the Commission would erase the old bloodlines that once guaranteed influence. Others, especially the ambitious ones, feared something deeper. If Luciano could remove kings, what stopped him from removing anyone? Vito Genovese, once a close ally, watched Luciano's every move with a mix of admiration and envy. Genovese didn't want order, he wanted dominance. And the more Luciano succeeded, the more Genovese's resentment grew in silence, deepening like a shadow behind Luciano's throne. Genovese smiled at meetings. He pledged loyalty. He obeyed orders. But inside he made a quiet decision. No empire should belong to one man. And if it did, it should belong to him. This thought, tiny, quiet, poisonous, was the beginning of the secret betrayal that would one day shake Luciano's world. Unseen enemies, rivalries that hid behind respect. Luciano's visible enemies were easy to kill. It was the invisible ones who posed the true danger. Underbosses whispered among themselves, "Luciano is too trusting. Luciano listens too much to non-Italians. Luciano negotiates too much. Luciano is making crime too organized." To the old guard, order was weakness. To the young guard, unity was unnatural. And in both camps, the seeds of revolt quietly grew. Some felt overshadowed by Lansky's brilliance. Some feared Siegel's unpredictability. Some resented Luciano's refusal to bow to Sicilian rituals. And some wanted what he had. But none of them dared strike openly, not yet. The empire glows brightest before the shadows deepen. By the early 1930s, Luciano stood at the pinnacle of criminal power. His name was whispered in nightclubs, union halls, police stations, and political offices. He was respected, feared, admired, and in private, quietly resented. His empire was vast. His alliances strong. His innovations unmatched. But beneath the surface, small fractures formed. Loyal men questioning motives, ambitious men plotting futures without him, jealous men counting his victories, old-world bosses waiting for him to stumble. Luciano believed he had learned to predict every man around him. He believed his systems made betrayal obsolete. He believed his alliances would outlast envy. But the truth of every empire is simple. The threat you see is never the one that destroys you. It's the one you don't. And in the shadows of the empire Luciano built, quiet, patient, nearly invisible, his greatest enemy was already beginning to move. Long before Lucky Luciano reshaped the American underworld, the Mafia already had a sacred doctrine, Omerta, the ancient code of silence. In Sicily it held villages together. In America it held criminal networks together. And in Luciano's empire, it became something more powerful than any weapon or alliance. Omerta was loyalty. Omerta was obedience. Omerta was survival. But it was also fragile, a truth Luciano understood better than the men who worshipped it. Because Omerta, for all its mythology, rested not on strength, but on human nature. And human nature cracks. The myth of Omerta, silence as honor to the old-world mafiosi. Omerta was a sacred moral code. Never speak to authorities. Never betray another member. Never question the hierarchy. Never reveal secrets. It was presented as a higher ethic, something that separated the Mafia from ordinary criminals. In Sicily, it was about survival under oppressive regimes. In America, it became a symbol of identity, a cultural anchor in a foreign land. Men lived by it. Men died for it. Men killed to protect it. And yet, for all its weight, omerta was still just a promise, spoken quietly, held privately, and tested constantly. Luciano respected the code, but he did not romanticize it. He saw what others ignored. Luciano's interpretation: omerta as strategy, not religion. Unlike traditional bosses who treated omerta as a sacred oath, Luciano treated it as a tool, a psychological instrument that allowed his empire to function smoothly. To him, omerta was not loyalty for loyalty's sake. It was controlled information. It was a way to limit leaks, maintain internal order, create predictable behavior, ensure obedience without force. He didn't rely on honor. He relied on incentives. Loyalty was rewarded. Silence was profitable. Trust was transactional. Luciano believed deeply in systems, not sentiment. And omerta, reinterpreted through his eyes, became the backbone of a criminal corporation, the one rule that allowed diverse factions, personalities, and ambitions to coexist. But even systems have weaknesses. Even silence vibrates under pressure. Trust, the invisible currency of power. More than money, more than manpower, Luciano dealt in trust. But trust in the Mafia wasn't affection, it was calculation. A man could be trusted if his fear was stronger than his ambition aligned with Luciano's interests, his survival depended on the empire, he benefited from the status quo. Luciano didn't trust blindly. He trusted patterns. He knew which men cracked under heat, which men lied easily, which men hid envy behind loyalty. His psychological acuity made him almost untouchable, a man who could predict betrayal before it surfaced. Almost. What he didn't yet realize was that the greatest threat to his empire would come not from a man without loyalty, but from a man who hid ambition behind perfect obedience. Where omerta worked, and why under Luciano, omerta became the glue that held together men who otherwise had no reason to cooperate. Italians, Jews, Irish, union men, racketeers, and businessmen all played roles in the same machine, and omerta served as the silent contract binding them. It worked because fear created consistency, profit created motivation, structure created predictability, diplomacy reduced violence. Luciano's brilliance wasn't that he enforced silence. It was that he made silence beneficial. Breaking omerta meant losing protection, influence, and money. Keeping it meant advancement. Yet as the empire grew, so did the cracks. The more men who depended on omerta, the more fragile the code became. Because trust built on necessity is strong, until necessity shifts. The real-world fragility, cracks beneath the perfect surface. In theory, omerta was unbreakable. In practice, it was constantly under strain. Fear protected the code, but fear also drove whispers. Honor upheld the code, but honor meant nothing to hungry men. Profit strengthened the code, but profit created envy. Silence united the empire, but silence also concealed resentment. Every man had a limit. Every man had a price. Every man had a breaking point. The street soldier threatened with prison. The underboss insulted in private. The captain who felt overshadowed by Luciano's inner circle. The ambitious lieutenant who believed he deserved more. Omerta didn't eliminate betrayal. It delayed it. And Luciano, despite all his foresight, could not see every pressure point forming beneath him. The empire's hidden weak points, trust misplaced even in Luciano's early success, even as the commission was forming and profit soared, subtle signs of fragility appeared. A captain withholding earnings, a soldier secretly aiding a rival faction, a consigliere who observed too much and spoke too little, an ambitious ally masking resentment as loyalty. None of these events were large enough to threaten the empire. But together they formed a pattern, a quiet hum beneath the machinery of power. Luciano dismissed some concerns as normal friction. He underestimated others as harmless jealousy. And in one particular case, he trusted a man who should have been watched more closely. This man, unnoticed by many, underestimated by most, would one day play a role in the betrayal that nearly collapsed everything Luciano built. For now he remained in the background, silent, obedient, loyal in appearance. Omerta protected him. Omerta concealed him. Omerta made him invisible. Luciano's great strength was understanding men. His great vulnerability was assuming he understood all of them. The code's paradox, stability built on silence. The tragedy of omerta lies in its paradox. It binds men together, yet it prevents them from speaking when danger grows. It ensures loyalty, yet it hides disloyalty until it's too late. It protects empires, yet it conceals the rot beneath them. Luciano believed he had redesigned omerta for the modern world, turning it from superstition into strategy. But he could not eliminate its psychological core, the human instinct to protect oneself when threatened. And one day, when ambition, fear, and survival collided, The sacred code meant to preserve his empire would become the very thing that allowed betrayal to thrive in silence. Omerta held everything together. But it also kept the truth hidden. Until the moment it exploded. The empire was strong. The code was sacred. The trust felt unbreakable. But in the shadows, the first fractures had already begun. As Lucky Luciano's empire expanded, so did its shadows. What began as a network of alliances and disciplined operations grew into a sprawling underground economy. One that stretched across oceans, infiltrated cities, and shaped the political pulse of entire industries. To outsiders, Luciano seemed untouchable. To insiders, he seemed unstoppable. But the deeper his world sank into secrecy, the more dangerous it became. Because success demands silence, silence demands trust, and trust, Luciano knew, was the most fragile currency of all. He thought he could manage it. He thought he understood every man around him. He thought the system would hold. He didn't yet know the cost of power built in the dark. Narcotics, the global pipeline that required blind faith. Though alcohol and gambling had made Luciano rich, narcotics promised something larger. International scale. Heroin flowed from Turkey into Marseille, from Marseille into New York, and from New York into veins across America. The operation required smugglers with no paper trail, chemists who never met their employers, couriers willing to die before speaking, politicians willing to look the other way. Luciano didn't participate directly. He controlled the architecture. He coordinated connections, approved partnerships, and ensured that profits were protected by silence. But this pipeline was different from his other enterprises. It stretched too far, relied on too many people, and drew too much attention. Worst of all, it demanded trust in places where obedience could not be enforced. Every shipment was a risk. Every link a potential traitor. Every success a reminder of how quickly things could collapse. And in the narcotics world, betrayal didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly through shortages, altered purity, or whispers from foreign ports. Luciano kept expanding the operation anyway. The profits were too large. The demand too strong. The ambition too intoxicating. He believed the system would hold. But in expanding it, he unknowingly empowered men whose loyalty was rooted in fear, and would crumble the moment fear shifted. Gambling, the empire's beating heart. If narcotics were the empire's bloodstream, gambling was its heart. It created predictable revenue, stabilized alliances, and funded political influence. Luciano turned gambling into an organized industry. Standardized odds, reliable payouts, protection agreements, secret partnerships with businessmen and corrupt officials. Casinos in New York, racetracks in Florida, operations in Cleveland and Chicago. Every city became a vein feeding the national syndicate. But gambling brought a different danger: visibility. Clubs attracted celebrities. Bookmakers attracted wealthy clients. Fixers attracted reporters. The very success of the business demanded secrecy, yet drew eyes. To manage the growing exposure, Luciano relied heavily on lieutenants. Men tasked with handling sensitive meetings, distributing profits, and smoothing conflicts before they reached him. Some were loyal. Some were ambitious. Some hid envy behind smiles. Luciano believed he could read all of them. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. The more men he trusted, the less he controlled. Prostitution, a system built on silence and ruin. Prostitution was the underworld's quietest and most corrosive industry. Luciano reorganized it with cold efficiency. Brothels standardized, madams held accountable, police bribed monthly, health checks enforced, violence minimized in favor of profit. But prostitution carried a unique vulnerability. Its workers were the least predictable and the most exploited. Their desperation made them unreliable. Their suffering made them volatile. Their fear made them dangerous. Dewey would later use this system to destroy him, but even before the trial, signs of liability appeared. Women who disappeared, operators who skimmed funds, low-level enforcers who talked too loudly, political contacts who grew nervous. Luciano's empire depended on layers of silence. But prostitution required a kind of secrecy that could not be controlled through charm or strategy. Inside this system lived the earliest cracks. Men who would eventually turn, women who would eventually speak, and intermediaries whose loyalty was paper-thin. He didn't see it then. Not clearly. Not dangerously. But the secret that would one day threaten everything was already lurking in these shadows. Political corruption, power in broad daylight. Luciano's influence over unions allowed him to sway. Construction contracts, shipping routes, trucking companies, political appointments. City bosses consulted him. Police precincts depended on him. Judges respected his reach. This political network made him powerful, but also visible. The more legitimate institutions he touched, the more potential betrayals he created. Politicians are not like gangsters. Their loyalties shift with pressure, threats, exposure, or ambition. To maintain influence, Luciano needed intermediaries who walked between the criminal and political worlds. These were the men he had to trust the most, and fear the most. Because politicians don't take vows. They don't honor omerta. They don't die for the cause. They survive. Always. And survival is the purest enemy of loyalty. Success breeds secrecy. Secrecy breeds paranoia. As the empire expanded, Luciano could no longer manage every operation directly. He delegated. Shipments to underbosses, finances to accountants, negotiations to trusted lieutenants, enforcement to specialized crews, political outreach to smooth-tongued intermediaries. This delegation created efficiency. It also created distance. Where once he knew every man's motives, now he only knew reports. Where once he could sense betrayal, now he had to infer it. Where once he controlled information, now information passed through too many hands. Luciano didn't want to admit it, not to others, not even to himself, but something subtle had changed. The empire no longer felt fully his. And with that distance came paranoia. Why had profits dipped in one district? Why had a union representative missed 2 meetings? Why had a smuggler taken longer than usual to respond? Why had a lieutenant denied a detail Luciano knew to be true? Nothing concrete. Nothing provable. Just a feeling, a faint tremor in the architecture he had built. A tremor caused not by one man, but by the unavoidable truth. Power creates shadows and shadows hide enemies. Dependence. The one weakness Luciano never saw coming. Luciano had always relied on intelligence, instinct, and personal oversight. But the empire's scale forced him to depend on others more than ever before. He needed their reports. He needed their silence. He needed their secrecy. He needed their loyalty. And loyalty, he was about to learn, is not guaranteed by fear or money or respect. It is fragile. It is conditional. It is vulnerable. And the man he trusted most, one who had watched the empire grow from the beginning, was already calculating the moment when loyalty would cost more than betrayal. Luciano's empire was thriving. But beneath the brilliance, beneath the profits, beneath the extraordinary reach, the first cracks had already begun to widen. He could not see the full danger yet. But it was there. Silent. Patient. Waiting. At the height of his power, Lucky Luciano saw himself as the center of a perfectly balanced machine. Gears turning in harmony, profits flowing smoothly, alliances locked in place like bolts in steel. But the greater his influence grew, the more that machine depended on men whose ambitions, fears, and resentments he could not fully control. Some called themselves friends. Some pretended to be allies. Some hid their envy behind smiles. And some, quietly, patiently, were already imagining life after Luciano. This is where the seeds of betrayal began to germinate. Vito Genovese, the shadow beside the throne of all the men in Luciano's world, none were more dangerous than Vito Genovese, not because he openly defied Luciano but because he never did. His loyalty was too polished, his obedience too smooth, his silence too controlled. Genovese was the kind of man who understood patience as a weapon. He admired Luciano. He learned from him. He envied him. But above all, Genovese wanted what Luciano had, not the system, not the alliances, but the crown that Luciano claimed to have abolished. To Genovese, the commission was a compromise. To Luciano, it was the future. To Genovese, it was a cage, one that prevented any one man from becoming supreme. And Genovese did not believe in shared power. He believed in singular dominance. Luciano trusted Genovese because he believed he understood him. He believed Genovese had ambition but also limits. What he didn't see was that ambition without scruples has no limits. And Genovese possessed neither loyalty nor conscience where power was concerned. In Genovese's quiet eyes, a storm was forming. Dutch Schultz, a loose cannon ready to ignite everything if Genovese was the silent threat. Dutch Schultz was the loud one, unpredictable, volatile, and explosive. Schultz ran Harlem's numbers racket and believed the city owed him everything. He saw himself as a genius, but Luciano saw something different. A man too careless to survive in the world he was trying to reshape. Schultz refused to follow the commission's rules. He pushed boundaries. He started wars that cost everyone money. He attracted police attention like a magnet attracts iron. When Schultz wanted to kill prosecutor Thomas Dewey, the commission voted no. A murder like that would bring the entire U.S. government crashing down on them. Schultz didn't care. Luciano knew he had a choice. Let Schultz break the system or remove him before he destroyed everything. When the commission ultimately sanctioned Schultz's assassination, it protected Luciano's empire, but it created a new fracture. Some men now believed Luciano was capable of killing anyone who threatened the machine, even old allies. Fear crept in where trust used to be. And fear has a way of twisting into suspicion. Allies with hidden calculations, the quiet movers in Luciano's circle beyond Lansky and Siegel, the two men Luciano trusted most, stood a collection of captains, advisors, and underbosses whose loyalties were less certain. Frank Costello, the savvy politician of the underworld, Costello used influence rather than violence. He respected Luciano genuinely, but he also feared that the growing chaos around them, especially from men like Schultz, would eventually tear the commission apart. Costello remained loyal, but his caution deepened. Joey Adonis, a smooth-talking earner who thrived in Luciano's system. Adonis benefited from every structural innovation Luciano introduced. But he also watched carefully, memorizing every shift in power. His loyalty was real but conditional. He followed strength, not sentiment. Under bosses across the five families, some felt empowered by Luciano's reforms. Others felt marginalized. They had grown up in a world of strict Sicilian control, and they saw Luciano's alliances with Jews, Irishmen, and non-traditional partners as a threat to their identity. They wouldn't betray him, not yet, but resentment was simmering. In Luciano's world, resentment was the first step toward rebellion. Enemies in disguise, the men who played the long game. Not every foe presented himself as such. Some offered loyalty, advice, and collaboration, but their motives were never clean. Carlo Gambino, quiet, observant, calculating. He rarely made bold moves, but he noticed everything. Luciano underestimated Gambino because Gambino rarely spoke. But silence can be more dangerous than shouting. Gambino watched as men like Schultz destabilized the empire and men like Genovese schemed for power. He waited, absorbing the weaknesses in Luciano's system like a sponge. He was not a traitor yet. But he was preparing for the day loyalty became optional. Narcotics lieutenants, the men who handled narcotics routes between Europe and America, lived in a world of secrecy so thick even Luciano could not penetrate it fully. Smugglers lied about shipments. Middlemen skimmed profits. Foreign contacts shifted alliances. These men did not betray Luciano out of ambition, they betrayed him out of survival. And survival is the deadliest motive. How suspicion begins? The psychology of power under pressure. Luciano's genius allowed him to read men better than any boss before him. But even he could not read what was never shown. The first signs of betrayal were not loud. They were subtle. A change in tone during meetings, a delayed message, a missing payment, a nervous glance, a whisper cut short, a captain arriving too early or too late. Nothing concrete. Nothing actionable. Just enough to make Luciano feel the quiet shift beneath his feet. And for the first time in years he felt something he hated. Uncertainty. Ambition was rising in the shadows. Fear was rising among the loyal. Pressure was rising from the government. Doubt was rising inside the commission. Trust, once his greatest strength, was now a fragile weapon. The blind spot, the man he should have feared. Luciano's instinct had kept him alive for decades. His systems protected him. His alliances strengthened him. His vision elevated him. But even he had a blind spot. He trusted the wrong man. Not Schultz. Not the rebellious captains. Not the quiet observers. But someone closer. Someone patient. Someone who watched him rise, supported his decisions, and studied every move he made. Someone who believed the empire belonged not to a council, but to a king. A king he intended to replace. Luciano could sense tension in the air, but he didn't yet know its source. The seeds had been planted. They were growing in silence. The betrayal had not happened yet, but its roots were already deep. And when it finally arrived, it would strike from the one direction he never guarded, inside the gates. Power, for Lucky Luciano, had always been a quiet force, felt but not seen, feared but not spoken of. His empire moved like a tide, steady, controlled, predictable. But tides shift. Currents change. And by the mid-1930s, a silent war had begun. It wasn't the kind of war fought with guns or revenge killings. It was a war fought in committee rooms, newsrooms, courtrooms, and, most dangerously, in Luciano's own council chambers. It was invisible. It was psychological. It was everywhere. And it was closing in. The government changes its strategy. Luciano becomes a target for years. Law enforcement treated organized crime as a nuisance, something to swat at, not dismantle. But public outrage, economic unrest, and political ambition began reshaping their priorities. The days of police turn-a-blind-eye corruption were fading. replaced by a new generation of prosecutors who wanted fame and reform. At the forefront stood Thomas E. Dewey, a young, relentless prosecutor who saw organized crime not as an underworld problem, but as a personal mandate. Where others saw syndicates, Dewey saw a ladder he could climb. Where others shrugged at vice, Dewey saw headlines. Where others feared Luciano, Dewey saw an opportunity to become a hero. He didn't care that Luciano avoided violence. He didn't care that Luciano rarely appeared in criminal reports. He didn't care that no direct evidence tied Luciano to major crimes. Dewey understood one truth: if you cut off the head of the machine collapses. Luciano was the head. Surveillance and scrutiny, the net titans quietly police didn't raid Luciano's operations. They infiltrated them. Officers followed men carrying envelopes to backrooms. Agents watched union men meet with unfamiliar faces. Detectives noted every visit to certain nightclubs. Reporters joined the hunt too, eager to expose corruption and elevate their careers. Newspapers began publishing speculative articles about a shadowy vice king, a mastermind quietly orchestrating New York's criminal heartbeat. Everyone knew they were talking about Luciano, even if they didn't have proof. This pressure brought something dangerous into Luciano's world: panic. Not his panic. Other men's panic. And panic breeds betrayal faster than ambition. Inside the commission, cracks behind polished smiles, the commission had been Luciano's greatest achievement. A council of bosses who kept peace through organization rather than fear. But cooperation is strongest in silence and weakest under scrutiny. The moment newspapers ran headlines about national crime networks, commission members began questioning everything. Are we too visible? Is Luciano bringing too much heat? Is this structure helping us, or exposing us? Some bosses feared Dewey's crusade. Some blamed Luciano personally. Some whispered that the empire had grown too large too fast. And one man, Vito Genovese, saw opportunity in the chaos. He observed the fear around him. He nurtured it. He let it grow like mold between alliances. Genovese didn't need to accuse Luciano. He only needed others to doubt him. Ambitious factions and hidden conversations. Many lieutenants and captains, men who had quietly resented Luciano's modernized approach, began meeting privately. Every closed-door conversation threatened stability. Some feared Luciano's relationships with Meyer Lansky and Jewish syndicates. Some envied Siegel's access and influence. Some believed that aligning with Genovese now would pay off later. In these whispered gatherings, half-truths turned into warnings. Luciano is becoming reckless. The government won't stop until they get him. If he goes down, he'll take us all with him. We need a new leader, one who understands the old ways. Loyalty cracked in silence. Fear moved faster than reason. And Luciano's name, admired for years, became a liability whispered in the dark. Luciano feels the shift. The air tightens around him. Luciano had always read men's intentions like open books. But now the pages were blank. Meetings felt different. Smiles felt forced. Reports felt incomplete. Small inconsistencies piled up. Information came slower. Excuses came faster. He recognized the signs: men avoiding eye contact. Lieutenants skipping minor meetings. Captains sending representatives instead of appearing themselves. Questions that felt like tests, not conversations. Luciano felt pressure not just from the government, but from his own ranks. His greatest strength, delegation, was now his greatest vulnerability. He had built a machine so large he could no longer see all its parts. Worse, the men who operated those parts no longer moved with the same confidence. Fear becomes a tactic, used against him. Dewey's public campaign terrified low-level operators, especially those running gambling and prostitution rings. These were the men most exposed to raids, most vulnerable to interrogation, most likely to panic. And panic is contagious. A croupier arrested in Midtown whispered about bigger bosses. A madam caught in Brooklyn blamed a man above all of them. A numbers runner in Harlem pointed to the top. No one had real evidence. They just wanted shorter sentences. But for Dewey, sentiment mattered more than truth. He needed a villain. Luciano's myth, once his shield, was becoming a prosecutor's weapon. The narrative had turned. Inside Luciano's mind, the first true doubt: Luciano had survived gang wars, political machinations, and violent transitions of power. But this was different. This was a war he couldn't see. A war with no battleground. A war waged on newspaper pages, in backrooms, in whispered fears. He sensed he was being boxed in. The government was tightening pressure from above. The commission was losing faith from the sides. Ambitious rivals were digging from below. And somewhere, In a place he could not yet identify, someone close to him was waiting for the moment when the pressure became unbearable. He could feel the betrayal forming. Like a storm you smell before you see the clouds. The political climate, reformers rising, corruption fading. The 1930s brought Roosevelt's reforms, public outrage toward corruption, and a political appetite for symbolic victories. Organized crime was the perfect target. Police chiefs wanted relevance. District attorneys wanted headlines. Politicians wanted moral applause. Journalists wanted sensation. And they all wanted Luciano's head. The era of backroom deals and bribed officers was fading. Men who once protected Luciano were now pressured, threatened, or replaced. Judges became cautious. Police captains refused envelopes. Detectives followed orders more closely. The corridors Luciano once walked freely had changed their shape. He was no longer a hidden force. He was a national figure, and a national threat. The quiet tightening, an empire surrounded in public, Luciano still appeared calm. In private he felt the walls closing. He wasn't losing control, he was losing insulation. The men who once protected him were now protecting themselves. The government that once ignored him was now hunting him. The allies who once admired him were now questioning him. The rival who once feared him, Genovese, was now positioning himself. And all of it was happening quietly. Too quietly. The hidden war had begun long before Luciano realized it. By the time he did, the forces closing in were already in motion. What he didn't know, but would soon discover, was that the greatest threat wasn't Dewey or Schultz's fallout, or the reformers in Washington. It was a man sitting close to his table. Silent. Patient. Watching him weaken. Waiting for the perfect moment. The betrayal was no longer a seed. It was growing roots. And the walls were almost done tightening. Every empire has a moment when its foundation cracks. Not from an enemy attack, not from a political storm, but from a whisper in the dark. For Lucky Luciano, that moment arrived not with a gunshot or a raid, but with a secret that slipped through the walls of his own creation. A betrayal. Quiet. Calculated. Fatal. One he never saw coming. The perfect storm, pressure outside, weakness inside. By the time prosecutor Thomas Dewey intensified his crusade, Luciano was already fighting a hidden war on two fronts. Law enforcement closing in, gathering scraps of testimony and building a narrative around him. Internal fear and ambition, creating silence where clarity was needed, and whispers where loyalty once stood. He believed his systems would protect him. He believed Omerta would hold. He believed the alliances he built were too strong to fracture. What he didn't anticipate was that the enemy wasn't just outside the empire. The enemy was sitting at the table. The enemy knew his patterns, his secrets, his vulnerabilities. And the enemy had everything to gain by letting him fall. The first leak, a name where no name should be, it began with a report Dewey received from a small-time informant. Nothing significant, nothing actionable. But the man described something chilling, an underworld meeting with decisions being made at a higher level. He used a name he shouldn't have known, Charlie Lucky. This wasn't the name street thugs used. This wasn't a rumor floating across bars. This was the kind of detail only someone close to the commission could have passed along. Dewey dismissed the informant's credibility, but he did not dismiss the name. It became a thread to pull. And Dewey was very good at pulling threads. The silent messenger. Information that shouldn't exist. Soon after, Dewey's office received an anonymous tip through a middleman who claimed he overheard conversations about vice rackets. The details were too precise. Names of brothels Luciano never visited, income structures Luciano never personally handled, coded references to meetings only inner circle men attended. It was as if someone had summarized the blueprint of the prostitution network and laid it before the prosecutor. Dewey didn't know who leaked the information. But Luciano did. He felt the shift immediately. He recognized inconsistencies in reports from his lieutenants. He sensed hesitation in meetings. He spotted fear where confidence used to sit. Somewhere, someone had broken Omerta, not because they were weak but because the internal pressure had become unbearable, or because ambition had outgrown loyalty. The prime suspect, and the hidden truth. To this day, historians debate exactly who betrayed Luciano. But within the world he ruled, one name rises above the rest: Vito Genovese. He had motive. He had opportunity. He had ambition. Genovese had always wanted the throne Luciano refused to claim. He believed the commission stripped the Mafia of its rightful hierarchy, that he, not Lucky, should one day rule as an undisputed king. And what better path to power than letting the government eliminate the man standing in his way? If Luciano fell, Genovese's rivals weakened, the commission destabilized, and the old world hierarchy could be restored, with Genovese at its peak. But Genovese was too smart to betray openly. He used intermediaries. He let fear do the talking. He let frightened men leak fragments, truths mixed with lies, until Dewey had just enough to build a case. And when the pressure grew intense, Genovese conveniently fled to Italy, avoiding the storm he'd helped create. No direct proof. No confession. Just a vacuum where loyalty should have been. Luciano never publicly accused him. But privately he knew. The betrayal had a face. When the secret erupted, Dewey's case takes shape. The final blow came when a group of prostitutes, arrested during raids, began speaking of higher orders and men behind the scenes. Their stories contradicted each other, but one detail remained consistent: Luciano's name. They weren't inventing it. They weren't smart enough to. Someone had planted it, someone who knew that Dewey needed a villain, and the public wanted a kingpin. In one moment the world shifted. Luciano wasn't just a strategist anymore, he was the symbol of national vice. And he knew that somewhere in his circle, someone had helped build that symbol. Not fully. Not intentionally. But enough. Enough to put a spotlight on the one man who had always lived in shadows. The psychological blow. Trust shatters for Luciano. The greatest devastation wasn't the charges. It wasn't the evidence. It wasn't even the trial. It was the realization that the system he had built, the system designed to eliminate betrayal, had enabled it. He replayed conversations. He reconsidered old loyalties. He scrutinized every silence he once ignored. The man who could read ambition in a handshake had missed the ambition closest to him. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of what betrayal meant. It meant his empire was not invincible. It meant his structure was not perfect. It meant his vision, his masterpiece, had a flaw at its core. A human flaw. And human flaws can destroy empires. The moment he knew, the moment came during a meeting with his closest advisors. Their eyes avoided his. Their voices were too careful. Their answers too vague. Luciano realized then that the betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a chain reaction. Fear from low-level operators, ambition from rivals, pressure from prosecutors, silence from allies. The secret that nearly destroyed him wasn't just that someone talked. The secret was that multiple people did, because fear and ambition had overtaken the code he once believed in. Omerta had not broken in one place. It had cracked everywhere. And Luciano, the architect of unity, stood alone in the ruins of trust. The fall begins by the time Dewey assembled his case. Luciano understood something profoundly tragic. He wasn't brought down by the government. He wasn't brought down by enemies. He was brought down by the one thing he spent his life managing: human nature. It was ambition that betrayed him. It was fear that betrayed him. It was survival that betrayed him. But most painfully, it was someone he trusted. That betrayal didn't just end his freedom. It ended the illusion that he was untouchable. And from that moment forward, the fall of Lucky Luciano was not a legal outcome. It was a psychological collapse. A man who built a kingdom in silence was undone by the silence of others. The knock on Lucky Luciano's hotel door was not loud. It didn't need to be. Power doesn't always fall with an explosion. Sometimes it collapses with a quiet tap, the kind that signals inevitability rather than violence. Luciano had survived ambushes, street wars, and coups. He had outmaneuvered kings of the underworld. But when the police entered that room in March 1936, there were no gunmen behind them. No rival family waiting in the wings. No showdown. There was only the deception he never saw coming. And the moment the cuffs tightened around his wrists, he knew the betrayal had already happened. Dewey strikes. The government finally finds its opening prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey didn't arrest Luciano because he had clear evidence. He arrested him because he had momentum. Public outrage, political support, and whispered testimonies stitched together into a believable narrative. The charges? Compulsory prostitution. A crime Luciano never needed to dirty his hands with, yet a charge perfectly engineered to destroy him publicly. Dewey's case was built on terrified prostitutes naming Luciano under pressure, pimps implying higher authority to save themselves, intermediaries offering fragments of truth, and one internal betrayal that guided Dewey exactly where he needed to look. No single witness could convict Luciano. But together they built a story. And stories win trials. The news spreads like a fire. Panic in the underworld. When word of Luciano's arrest spread, it hit the criminal world like an earthquake. Every corner of the underworld felt the shift. Bookmakers froze their collections. Brothel operators vanished overnight. Union heads refused meetings. Politicians quietly cut ties. 4 years, Luciano had been the invisible architect, a stabilizing force who kept the system efficient, predictable, and profitable. But when the architect fell, everyone realized the same terrifying truth. If he could be taken down, no one was safe. Fear spread through the 5 families. Some whispered that Dewey's crusade wouldn't end with Luciano. Others wondered who had cracked under interrogation. And many, far too many, wondered what Luciano could reveal if he ever talked. Their fear told its own story. Trust had begun to rot long before the arrest. Inside the commission, a throne without a king while Luciano sat in custody, the commission, the governing body he created, descended into quiet chaos. Some bosses argued for unity. Some argued for caution. Some argued for replacing Luciano entirely. And in that uncertainty, Vito Genovese emerged from the shadows like a patient wolf. He didn't accuse Luciano. He didn't defend him either. He simply positioned himself as the man who could restore order in this dangerous moment. The brilliance of Genovese's maneuver was simple. He didn't need to orchestrate the betrayal. He only needed to take advantage of it. In Luciano's absence, the commission was no longer a council. It was a battlefield waiting for its next ruler. Luciano in custody, a king stripped of his vision, locked in a cell, Luciano felt something he hadn't felt since childhood: blindness. He couldn't see who was panicking. He couldn't see who was lying. He couldn't see who was plotting. His empire was a living thing, built on moving parts, flowing money, shifting alliances, and silent promises. And now he had to watch it all from behind bars. The man who built an empire on insight was now trapped in darkness. He replayed every decision: who among his allies had reason to turn? Which lieutenant had cracked? Which frightened operator had whispered his name? Which ambitious rival had fed Dewey just enough truth? He didn't have proof, but he had instinct. And instinct told him the betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a chain reaction. Fear, ambition, pressure, and one hidden enemy who let the pieces fall. The streets shift, opportunists rise, loyalties crumble. With Luciano taken off the chessboard, the underworld reshaped itself aggressively. Narcotics lieutenants began skimming profits, sensing freedom. Gambling crews renegotiated territory behind closed doors. Union connections drifted to whoever seemed safer. Rival families edged into Luciano-controlled districts. Without his presence, the balance of power destabilized instantly. He'd believed he created a system strong enough to outlast him. He was wrong. The system wasn't built to survive his absence. It was built to survive everyone else. And now the cracks widened into fractures. Dewey tightens the noose. The trial machine activates. Dewey used the arrest as public theater. Newspapers exploded with headlines: Lucky Luciano caught, Vice King goes down. The more the public loved the story, the more witnesses appeared. A frightened madam who feared prison, a nightclub operator desperate for protection, a low-level associate terrified of mob retaliation. They exaggerated. They speculated. They filled in gaps Dewey hadn't even asked about. Every lie strengthened Dewey's narrative. Every truth twisted into a weapon. Every rumor became a tool. Luciano wasn't fighting evidence. He was fighting a story America wanted to believe. And the betrayal inside his network made that story unstoppable. The emotional breaking point: when control slips completely despite his calm exterior, Luciano felt the psychological blow deep and sharp. His empire no longer moved at his command. The men he trusted were silent. The commission was drifting. The newspapers were rewriting his identity. And somewhere, someone close to him was watching it all unfold with satisfaction. For a man who built his world on control, nothing was more devastating than losing the one thing he valued most: certainty. Luciano had always believed he understood human nature. But he had misjudged one man, one motive, one weakness. And that crack had become a fault line. The real collapse happened before the verdict. By the time Luciano's trial began, the fall had already happened. The betrayal had weakened him. The arrest had isolated him. The panic had splintered his network. The ambition around him had grown teeth. The empire wasn't collapsing because of Dewey. It was collapsing because the trust that held it together had shattered. One secret, one whisper, one betrayal. It was enough to nearly destroy the most powerful man in organized crime. The verdict would only finish what had already begun. The courtroom wasn't just a legal arena. It was a stage, and Lucky Luciano was cast as the villain America had been waiting for. From the moment he stepped inside, escorted by officers who walked with exaggerated authority, the atmosphere felt charged with spectacle rather than justice. This wasn't merely a trial. It was a public execution of reputation. The betrayal that had brought him here, quiet, invisible, devastating, now stood beside him like an unspoken witness. It shaped every accusation, every headline, every whisper in the gallery. Dewey had leveraged it with surgical precision, transforming fragments of half-truths and coerced testimony into a narrative powerful enough to crush the most influential man in organized crime. Luciano didn't need to be proven guilty. He only needed to be believed guilty. The prosecutor's theater, Dewey's grand performance. Thomas E. Dewey entered the courtroom not as a prosecutor, but as a man stepping into destiny. His reputation had soared ever since the arrest. Newspapers praised him as the fearless reformer America needed. He knew the cameras were on him. He knew every word would be printed the next morning. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He painted Luciano not as an elusive strategist, not as a businessman, but as a criminal emperor, a silent tyrant pulling every string in New York's vice industry. Dewey didn't present a case, he presented a mythology. Luciano ordered everything. Luciano oversaw everything. Luciano was the brain behind a city-wide machine of exploitation. The jury didn't understand the underworld, but they understood a villain. And Dewey gave them one. The witnesses, fear, desperation, and manufactured certainty. The prosecution's witnesses were a mosaic of fear. Prostitutes terrified of prison and public humiliation, pimps bargaining for lighter sentences, low-level operators desperate to shift blame, intermediaries repeating rumors as if they were fact. None of them could place Luciano at a crime scene. None had ever met him in person. None could prove his involvement. But all of them spoke his name. And that was enough. The betrayal inside Luciano's ranks had done its job. Someone had whispered the right details into Dewey's ear, details that let prosecutors guide their witnesses with uncanny precision. How was the money collected? Who approved the brothels? Who gave the orders? Witnesses, under pressure, simply filled in the blanks. Luciano became a symbol, an invisible mastermind whose power was so vast that even whispers felt like truth. And truth in a courtroom is often a matter of repetition. The media frenzy, headlines become evidence. Reporters lined the courtroom walls, scribbling notes, sketching Luciano's face, inflating every accusation into national scandal. Lucky, king of vice exposed, the man who sold women and ran New York. Dewey crushes the Mafia powerhouse, public opinion sharpened against him faster than any legal argument could counter. The more sensational the story, the more the newspapers sold. And the more the papers sold, the more guilty Luciano appeared. The betrayal that had broken his inner circle was now magnified by a public betrayal, the press turning his myth into a weapon. A jury can ignore evidence. It cannot ignore a nation demanding punishment. Luciano's defense. Words against the storm. Luciano's lawyers argued passionately. There was no direct evidence, no financial trail, no testimony from anyone close to Luciano, no proof he had ever commanded prostitution rings. They argued the entire case was built on hearsay and fear. They argued Dewey was using Luciano's name to launch a political career. They argued that the underworld's own internal betrayal had fed the prosecution false leads. But their voices were drowned out by the storm. The betrayal had changed the direction of the wind. The courtroom wasn't listening for truth. It was listening for a story. And Dewey's story was irresistible. The man in the spotlight, Luciano's inner collapse. Luciano sat still throughout most of the trial, watching the proceedings with the same calm that once intimidated men far more dangerous than Dewey. But inside, something colder and heavier was taking shape. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was a psychological assault. He was watching. Lies turned into facts, rumors turned into accusations, betrayal turned into evidence, and fear turned into a narrative that erased everything he had built. Luciano had always believed he controlled the shadows. But here, in the courtroom sunlight, those shadows betrayed him. And the worst part? He knew someone close to him had helped create this reality. But he couldn't call out the traitor. He couldn't rewrite the story. He couldn't defend himself against invisible knives. The jury decides. Reputation dies before the sentence. After weeks of testimony, the jury did not deliberate long. The prosecution didn't need airtight evidence. They had created a moral crisis. The jurors didn't ask, "What did Luciano do?" They asked, "What does his existence represent?" And so they returned with a verdict, guilty on 62 counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed out to file stories. Spectators nodded in satisfaction. Dewey smiled, a man who had just won the most important case of his life. And Luciano, for the first time, looked like a man who understood the full cost of betrayal. Not fear. Not anger, but a quiet devastation. The kind that cracks a foundation. The sentence, the final blow. The judge delivered the blow with dramatic weight. 30 to 50 years in prison. It wasn't just imprisonment, it was erasure. The man who built an empire was now reduced to a cautionary tale. But the sentence wasn't the true punishment. The true punishment was that his own world helped build the case against him. Whispers from frightened associates, silence from allies who once praised him, ambition from a man he trusted, and a betrayal that kept feeding Dewey's narrative until it became unstoppable. Luciano didn't lose to the government. He lost to the human nature he spent his life studying. His trial was not simply a legal defeat, it was the moment his reputation was executed in front of a nation. Prison did not break Lucky Luciano's body. It broke something far deeper, his certainty. The bars, the routines, the cold floors, the narrow bed, these were inconveniences. Luciano had survived worse. But what haunted him in those long nights wasn't confinement. It was the silence. The silence that reminded him over and over of the betrayal that put him here. A betrayal he hadn't anticipated. A betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet ever could. Behind those walls, Luciano confronted the one truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Even the smartest man can be deceived by the people he trusts most. A life reduced, a mind that wouldn't stop. Daily life in Clinton prison was mechanical. Wake, roll call, meals, labor, lights out. But Luciano's mind refused to follow prison routine. His thoughts kept moving, analyzing, dissecting every conversation, every decision, every alliance he had ever formed. The courtroom had taken his freedom. The betrayal had taken his clarity. He replayed the rise of his empire like a film reel. The alliances with Lansky and Siegel, the elimination of the old bosses, the creation of the commission, the expansion into narcotics and unions, the men he elevated, trusted, empowered. Every moment now came with a new question. Where had the betrayal started? Who had whispered his name? Which loyal soldier had cracked? Which ally had seen advantage in his fall? He knew the betrayal was not a single act, it was a chain reaction. But every chain has a first link. And finding that link became an obsession. Maintaining influence, a king behind walls even in chains, Luciano did not become irrelevant. Influence is not a suit you wear, it is a language you speak. And few men ever spoke it better. Through lawyers, visitors, coded letters, and carefully chosen intermediaries, he kept contact with the outside world. He settled disputes between families. He advised Lansky and Costello on political strategy. He cautioned younger captains about Genovese's ambition. He mediated internal turf disagreements through messengers. The commission still respected him, perhaps even more now that he had become a symbol of their vulnerability. But influence behind bars was not the same as command. It was softer. Rumored. Whispered. Power had transformed from something he executed into something he suggested. And every suggestion reminded him of what he had lost. Bitterness and reflection. The wounds that wouldn't heal. The bitterness arrived slowly, creeping through the cracks of his introspection. It wasn't anger toward Dewey or the prosecutors. Luciano had no illusions about the justice system. And it wasn't anger at the witnesses who lied under pressure. He understood fear. No, the bitterness was reserved for those he trusted. The betrayal gnawed at him like a quiet animal in the dark. In conversations with visitors, his tone changed. We built something good, too good. Men get greedy when things are too good. I should have watched more closely. I thought structure protected us. It didn't. It protected them. I trusted the wrong man. I gave him too much power. That's on me. But he never said the traitor's name. Not publicly. Maybe he wasn't certain. Maybe he was too certain. Maybe saying it aloud would make the wound real. His introspection went further than identifying the betrayer. It forced him to confront something uncomfortable. His own system, his masterpiece, had enabled the betrayal. Reevaluating power, the lesson he never wanted. Luciano had always believed that systems were stronger than men. Systems brought order. Systems prevented chaos. Systems removed emotion from leadership. But in prison he realized, systems do not eliminate betrayal. They conceal it. Men hide behind rules. Men hide behind structure. Men hide behind success. And the more layered the empire became, the easier it was for ambition to move undetected. His system had created too many intermediaries, too many secrets, too many channels of communication, too many places for loyalty to die quietly. What he built to protect himself had actually blinded him. And nothing haunted him more. The visitors, echoes of a world moving on. Visitors came in waves. Some came out of affection. Some out of guilt. Some out of obligation. some to show others they still had Luciano's ear. Lansky came with updates, always calm, always rational, always loyal. Siegel came with stories, paranoid, erratic, drifting into his own troubles. Costello came with political news, assuring Luciano his influence still mattered. But what Luciano heard between their words was more important. The world was moving without him. Decisions were being made faster. Alliances were shifting. New money was emerging. Younger bosses were rising. He felt like a ghost in a world he once commanded. The nights, where the betrayal lived during the day, Luciano remained composed. At night the facade cracked. He lay awake replaying every sign he missed. A hesitation in someone's voice, an odd question in a meeting, a delayed message, a change in Genovese's tone, a soldier's nervous glance, a union leader's silence. He had survived bullets, plots, and wars, yet he had been undone by something so subtle he could barely trace it. The betrayal wasn't a moment. It was a movement. A slow-building shift in loyalty he never fully saw. And in the dark, he confronted the most painful truth. He had always known betrayal was possible. He just never believed it would come from inside. A king still, but no longer sovereign, Luciano retained influence, but it no longer belonged fully to him. In prison he became more symbol than strategist, respected, consulted, but no longer essential. And with every passing year he felt the consequences of the betrayal more intensely, not just in his loss of power, but in the realization that the betrayal forced him into a depth of self-reflection he never wanted. He once believed he understood loyalty. He once believed he understood people. He once believed he could outthink every threat. Prison taught him the one lesson he had never prepared for. The greatest danger is not the enemy you see, but the friend you don't. When Charles Lucky Luciano stepped onto Italian soil in 1946, carrying a suitcase and a reputation, he was not returning home, he was being erased. America, the land where he had built an empire from nothing, had cast him out permanently. And for a man whose identity was forged in the streets of New York, deportation felt less like relocation and more like exile from his own story. Italy greeted him not with reverence but with suspicion. Police trailed him. Officials monitored him. Journalists labeled him a foreign criminal. To them he was not the architect of a modern underworld, he was simply another deported gangster. And in his first days walking through Naples, Luciano felt something colder than defeat: irrelevance. A new world he couldn't command. Italy in the post-war years was chaotic and fractured. Different mafia factions in Sicily and Naples operated according to old-world traditions that Luciano had long abandoned. Their bosses saw him as an outsider, too American in style, too modern in mindset, too connected to a world far beyond their reach. Luciano attempted to insert himself quietly, visiting old Sicilian contacts, meeting Neapolitan clan members, offering advice on organization and profit, hinting at international opportunities. But the truth was clear: he didn't belong. He had left Italy as a poor immigrant boy. He had returned as a king without a kingdom. In America, his mind had reshaped an entire underworld. In Italy, his name was both famous and useless. The attempt to rebuild, old skills in a new landscape. Luciano's instincts refused to die. He couldn't sit idly and let the world move without him. His ambition, scarred but alive, drove him to seek relevance. He attempted to reconnect with international narcotics networks, offering his skills in coordination and strategy. But the landscape had changed. Marseille was rising as a heroin hub. Corsican smugglers dominated French channels. Younger American gangsters had created their own pipelines. The commission back home no longer relied on him. Even his closest allies, Lansky, Costello, respected him deeply, but they no longer needed him to survive. Luciano had built an empire so strong that it no longer required its architect. That realization cut deeper than betrayal. Cuba, the last flicker of power in 1947, rumors spread across the Caribbean that Luciano had been seen in Havana, despite being banned from leaving Italy. The reports were true. With Lansky's help, Luciano attempted one final resurgence. Cuba's lenient politics and booming casino industry seemed like the perfect place to reinsert himself into the American underworld from a distance. And for a brief moment he tasted the old power again: meetings with mob delegates, involvement in casino discussions, influence over narcotics routes, whispers of a renewed syndicate role. But the illusion shattered quickly. It was. Intelligence learned of his presence. Washington pressured Batista. Cuban officials were forced to deport him. Luciano was placed on a plane back to Italy, a message delivered clearly and cruelly: you will never be relevant again. Back in Naples, A kingdom reduced to memories. Returning to Italy after Havana felt like a second exile. This time the finality was undeniable. He settled into a lonely routine in Naples. Quiet meals at the same cafes, walks along the waterfront, occasional visits from old friends, coded letters from America that carried respect but no power. He watched younger gangsters rise through a system he had created. They used his rules. They followed his designs. They grew rich from his blueprint. But none of them were his men. Luciano had become history while still alive. The shadow of betrayal, a wound that never closed even decades later, after exile, after loss, after years of isolation, the betrayal remained with him like an old scar that flared in cold weather. When visitors asked about the fall, he never gave details. But sometimes in unguarded moments, he hinted at the truth. I trusted too much. Someone talked, someone close. A man you eat with can kill you faster than one who shoots. He never named the betrayer. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe the ambiguity was the only control he had left. But the betrayal shaped everything. Whom he met, what he said, how much he trusted, the way he viewed power, the loneliness he carried. The betrayal that destroyed his empire now defined his exile. The final years, a legend haunted by silence. By the early 1960s, Luciano was physically aging but mentally sharp. He became an unofficial storyteller, recounting the rise and fall of the underworld to younger Italian acquaintances who saw him as a mythic figure. But he spoke carefully. He left out names. He left out details. He left out the wound. His final days were spent walking along the docks, smoking slowly, remembering a world that no longer existed, a world built by his ambition and undone by its own shadows. On January 26, 1962, Luciano collapsed of a heart attack at the Naples airport after meeting with a film producer who wanted to immortalize his life story. It was fitting, in a tragic way. The man who built an invisible empire died while someone attempted to turn him into a visible legend. A dawn without a throne, the final truth. In the end, Luciano did not die a ruler. He died a reminder. A reminder that power is temporary. A reminder that systems outlast their creators. A reminder that betrayal leaves deeper scars than prison bars. A reminder that the price of ambition is often paid in loneliness. He had shaped the American underworld more than any man before him. But in exile he learned the hardest lesson of all. A kingdom built in shadows cannot protect you from the shadows that follow. His empire survived. His influence endured. His name became legend. But in his final years, Lucky Luciano walked alone. A dawn without a throne, a king exiled from his own creation, a man haunted by the secret that nearly destroyed him. Betrayal is not a single moment. It is a fracture that spreads. A wound that echoes. A story that outlives the men who lived it. For Lucky Luciano, the betrayal that helped bring him down did more than end his personal power. It reshaped the Mafia itself. His fall was not just a cautionary tale. It became a turning point in the psychology, structure, and future of organized crime. The underworld did not simply lose its most visionary architect. It lost its sense of certainty. And in that uncertainty, a new era was born. One built on fear, ambition, and the haunting memory of how one secret can undo everything. A structural shift. The commission without its builder, Luciano's arrest, and the betrayal surrounding it forced the Mafia to confront a terrifying truth. No system is invincible, not even the one he created. The commission survived, but it changed. Where Luciano had imagined it as a council of equals, later bosses twisted it into something more paranoid and self-preserving. Meetings became more secretive, decision-making slowed, alliances became suspicious rather than cooperative, and every vote carried undertones of mistrust. The betrayal had proved that even well-designed institutions depend on the honesty of the men who run them. And once trust cracked at the highest level, the commission evolved into a political battlefield rather than a stabilizing body. Luciano had built the commission to prevent wars, but his fall showed that internal ambition could be more dangerous than external enemies. The rise of new bosses, ambition given permission. With Luciano gone, the men who had once stayed cautious in his presence began to move aggressively. His betrayal created a vacuum, and in the Mafia, vacuums invite predators. Foremost among them was Vito Genovese, the man long suspected of playing a role, direct or indirect, in Luciano's downfall. His ascent marked a shift from Luciano's strategic, cooperative leadership to a more authoritarian, self-serving ambition. Under Genovese and others like him, violence rose again, co-governance weakened, personal empires grew larger than collective interests. The old balance Luciano had fought so hard to create, the delicate peace built on shared profit, began to tip. His betrayal didn't just remove him. It validated the ambitions of every man who believed power should be seized, not negotiated. The Mafia became more fractured, more suspicious, more volatile. A psychological scar. Fear replaces trust. The most lasting legacy of Luciano's betrayal wasn't structural. It was psychological. For decades after his fall, Mafia bosses operated under a new assumption. Anyone can break. A soldier under pressure could flip. A capo could turn informant. A consigliere could whisper to a rival. An underboss could sabotage a don. Luciano's downfall proved that loyalty, even among the highest ranks, was conditional. In the years that followed, meetings were guarded by layers of intermediaries, dons trusted fewer advisors, decisions were hidden from more people, and paranoia became part of leadership. Bosses studied their own men more closely than they studied their enemies. This wasn't the world Luciano wanted. He had envisioned structure replacing chaos. Instead, betrayal replaced stability. The Mafia's emotional architecture shifted permanently. Where unity once stood, suspicion now grew. The myth of invincibility dies. A new reality emerges before Luciano. Mafia bosses believed they were untouchable so long as they controlled the streets. After Luciano, they learned that the government could target the top, public opinion could fuel prosecution, and internal betrayal could succeed where bullets failed. Luciano's story became a warning whispered to new generations. Even Lucky wasn't lucky enough to survive betrayal. His fall proved that power in organized crime is never absolute. It is conditional, granted by the people beneath you and revoked by the same hands. And that truth changed the Mafia forever. What the betrayal meant for Luciano's legacy. Luciano had built the most advanced criminal structure America had ever seen. He had ended wars, unified families, and professionalized the underworld. But his end revealed the flaw at the heart of every empire. Human nature cannot be engineered out of power. The system he built depended on loyalty, yet loyalty depends on individuals, and individuals can break. His betrayal became the defining contradiction of his legend. The man who best understood people was undone by them. The man who built the strongest structure couldn't protect himself from within. The man who made the Mafia modern couldn't stop it from devouring him. His legacy is both triumph and tragedy. He showed the world how powerful a criminal empire could become, and how vulnerable that empire is when trust fails. Final reflection. The architect and the human truth. Lucky Luciano's downfall did not end the Mafia. But it changed its DNA. He proved that systems matter. He proved that leadership matters. But he also proved something deeper, darker, and more universal. In the end, the greatest threat to any powerful man is not the enemy outside the walls, but the friend standing on the inside. The betrayal that nearly destroyed Luciano left a scar that shaped every boss after him. It taught the underworld that no empire, no matter how brilliant its architect, is safe from the shadows cast by human ambition. And so Luciano's true legacy is not just the empire he built, but the reminder that every empire has a fault line. Hiding beneath loyalty, waiting beneath trust, growing beneath silence, until the moment it decides to break.